The Last Hour by Maddox. Chapter 1. The Final Stand. The earth trembled beneath him as the thunder of distant artillery rumbled across the barren landscape. Every passing second felt like a heartbeat in a war that had dragged on too long. Captain Leo Ferris, a lone sniper, crouched low in the dirt, his breath steady despite the chaos erupting around him. His rifle was positioned, barrel pointing toward the distant horizon where enemy soldiers were preparing to advance. The wind was heavy, the air thick with dust and smoke from explosions, but his focus was absolute. He had one mission: survive. His team was just a few hundred yards behind enemy lines, a recon unit meant to gather intelligence and hit fast before retreating. But now they were trapped. The last of the support troops had been wiped out. The air was thick with the stench of burning fuel and the metallic taste of fear. In the chaos of the assault, Leo had become their lifeline. He wasn't just a sniper now. He was the last hope of his comrades. His rifle, a custom-made Barrett M82, was an extension of himself. The weight of the weapon felt comforting in his hands, a stark contrast to the chaos that swirled just beyond the scope. He had no room for error. His eyes, trained through the lens, scanned the field. A low ridge ahead, littered with the remains of fallen soldiers. His team was hunkered down in a scattered formation, hidden beneath whatever cover they could find. Leo's fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted the windage dial on his scope. His position was precarious. Behind him, a ridge dipped into a valley that led straight into enemy territory. If they didn't find a way out soon, they'd be overrun. Leo wasn't worried for himself, but the rest of his team, they were still alive, still moving, but only just. "Captain," a voice crackled through his earpiece, the static adding a sense of urgency. "We've got incoming. They're pushing hard from the east. We need you to hold them off as long as possible." Leo's pulse quickened, but his exterior remained calm. He nodded, though he knew no one could see it. "Copy that, Sergeant. Hold tight. I'll take care of them." He clicked the safety off his rifle, a sharp sound in the otherwise silent landscape. His heart beat in rhythm with the rapid-fire explosions nearby. Leo adjusted his position, leaning slightly into the dirt mound. The sniper's world was quiet, despite the chaos. He had trained for this. He was the calm in the storm, the predator watching, waiting, and choosing the moment when it was time to strike. Through the scope, he saw them. A small group of enemy soldiers, barely visible in the tall grass, moving in a tight formation. He could hear their muffled voices, the clink of equipment, the soft crunch of boots against the dirt. They were getting closer. Leo's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath controlled and steady. "2 clicks east," Leo muttered under his breath. "I've got a clear shot." He exhaled slowly, his mind focused solely on the target. His finger tightened, the shot rang out, loud and final in the silence of the desert. The first enemy soldier dropped, but there was no time to admire his handiwork. Leo quickly recalibrated, tracking another movement, another soldier breaking from cover. He fired again. Another hit. "Captain, they're advancing fast. Get us out of here," Sergeant Miller's voice was frantic, now clearly over the comms. Leo's mind raced. Their position was becoming more vulnerable by the minute. Every shot he took, every life he ended, felt like a weight on his conscience. But it was war. There were no second chances. His team depended on him. "Just keep your heads down," Leo replied, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "I'll make sure they don't get close." He squeezed off another round. The enemy soldiers scattered, taking cover. But Leo wasn't done. He tracked each movement like a hawk, eyeing its prey, his scope locking onto every possible target. One enemy soldier tried to break free from the group, running toward the ridge. Leo's scope followed the man's frantic sprint. His finger twitched, but he hesitated. Was there time for another shot? Was this one of the soldiers closing in on his team? It was a split-second decision. Leo adjusted his aim, and with a calm precision, he fired. The soldier dropped to the dirt. His breath caught for a moment, and Leo allowed himself a single second to breathe before his focus snapped back into place. The moment was fleeting. A distant explosion shook the ground, signaling the enemy's push from the east. "They're not stopping," Leo whispered, his mind calculating, his thoughts colder than the rifle in his hands. He scanned the horizon again. More enemy soldiers, more firepower. The tide was turning against them. His earpiece crackled again. "Captain, we've got casualties. Private Daniels is down. We need extraction now." Leo clenched his jaw. There was no time for a proper response. He had to act. "Stay down, Sergeant. Hold the line. I'm coming for you." As he repositioned himself, the wind kicked up again, carrying with it the acrid scent of burning oil. Leo knew there was no time left for hesitation. His team was depending on him. If he didn't finish this, they'd be slaughtered before they ever got the chance to escape. Leo knew one thing for certain. It was the last hour. This final stand, this moment of life and death, would determine everything. And he had to make sure that somehow, against all odds, his team survived. The sniper's world was quiet once again as he prepared for the next shot. Chapter 2: The Silent Decision. Leo's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he surveyed the chaos unfolding below him. The team's position had become more compromised by the second, and the pressure of the mission weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was the linchpin, the one person who could tip the scales between life and death. The very thought of losing another soldier, another comrade, was unbearable, but he couldn't let sentiment cloud his judgment. Not now. Through his rifle scope, he observed the small movements of enemy soldiers advancing from the east. The thick smoke made it hard to discern details, but Leo's eyes were sharper than most. Years of training, years of staying out of sight while others rushed headlong into danger, had taught him patience. His gaze flicked over the battlefield like a hawk searching for prey. He inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose, and checked his ammunition. He was down to his last 2 full magazines. His fingers tightened around the grip, but there was no panic. This was his element. This was where he thrived. "Captain, we can't hold them off forever," Sergeant Miller's voice crackled in his ear again, a little more strained than before. "We need a plan. Now." Leo's eyes remained fixed through the lens of his rifle. The enemy was regrouping, organizing themselves into squads that would undoubtedly begin their final assault soon. Time was running out. "Just keep your head down, Miller," Leo replied, his voice steady. "I'm not giving up on you." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at the edge of his mind. He had to make a choice soon. Could he trust his team to survive without him? Could he take out the right targets without endangering them further? Suddenly, a new sound pierced the air, faint but unmistakable, the hum of a helicopter in the distance, growing louder. Leo's eyes darted toward the sky, searching for any sign of salvation. Was this the reinforcements? Had they finally come to pull them out? He cursed under his breath. No, it wasn't reinforcements. The sound was too faint, too far away to offer immediate help. It was an enemy chopper, and it was coming in fast. Leo swung his rifle towards the approaching helicopter, scanning the undercarriage for any signs of hostile fire. The sight of the spinning blades only added to his sense of urgency. The chopper was scouting, looking for the final traces of their unit. If they were seen, if they were targeted, it would be the end of the line. He needed to act, and fast. Without waiting for an order, Leo quickly adjusted his aim, zeroing in on the enemy pilot. One clean shot was all it would take to take down the threat. His finger hovered over the trigger, his breathing shallow. He was about to squeeze the shot when...
"Captain, we've got movement!" Miller's voice cut through the crackling static. "They're pushing from the south now. We can't hold out much longer."
Leo's finger faltered. He couldn't afford to waste any more time on that helicopter. The lives of his comrades were at stake. He'd made his choice. He pulled away from his rifle, shifting his position. His heart rate spiked, but he steadied himself. He was losing precious moments, and the situation was growing direr by the second. He darted from cover, moving cautiously behind the ridge that had served as his sniper's nest for the last few hours. The earth was uneven, pocked with craters from the previous artillery bombardments. His boots thudded softly against the ground as he moved quickly yet carefully. "Everyone, listen up." Leo barked into his comms, his voice firm. "We're moving out. Get ready to move in 10. Miller, you stay with me. Everyone else on my mark." There was no argument. The team had grown accustomed to Leo's leadership style. Quick decisions, clear commands. It was what had kept them alive this long. But now, those commands had to be followed, no matter the risk. Behind him, Miller moved to his position. "We're going to make it out, Captain?" Leo didn't look back. He knew Miller's question wasn't just about the mission. It was about survival. But the answer had to be unspoken. Leo couldn't afford to show doubt. "Move when I say so," Leo said, his voice clipped. He crouched low, scanning the field once more. The chopper was still in the distance, moving closer now. Leo knew the advantage he had. He was a ghost in the shadows, just as deadly as any enemy sniper. The enemy would never know where the next shot would come from, but his own men needed him to act. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the air, an explosion too close to ignore. Leo's heart skipped a beat. His team had just been spotted. "Now!" Leo shouted, his voice breaking the tension like a whip crack. Miller sprinted into action, leading the team toward the concealed escape route they'd marked earlier, the one that led up the mountain toward a safe house just beyond enemy lines. The others followed, adrenaline surging through their veins. Leo stayed in the rear, watching their backs, his rifle ready for any threats. The ground shook again, this time from a series of blasts that sent plumes of smoke into the air. The enemy was gaining ground faster than Leo had anticipated. His team was nearing the valley's edge, their only chance at survival. They had to cross it. Without warning, a figure emerged from the smoke, a soldier, his silhouette barely visible in the haze. Leo didn't hesitate. His rifle was already raised. He pulled the trigger before the enemy soldier even had time to react. The soldier crumpled to the ground with a dull thud, his body falling into the dirt. But there were more, always more. "Keep moving," Leo barked at Miller, not allowing himself to look back. He knew every second was precious. He had to buy his team more time. Every shot fired counted. Leo's fingers worked swiftly as he reloaded, adjusting his aim, his heart hammering in his chest. The sniper's world was an endless calculation: distance, wind, trajectory. Nothing could be left to chance. The enemy was closing in. They'd be surrounded soon. Leo knew that they would either make it out of this alive, or they wouldn't. He fired again, another enemy soldier down. But his movements were slower now, his options narrowing. His rifle was starting to feel heavier with each shot, the weight of the responsibility growing heavier. Almost there, Miller's voice was strained, but it was filled with determination. Leo's mouth went dry as he glanced over his shoulder to ensure the rest of his team was still moving. The valley ahead was their last chance. The ridge was nearly within reach, but the enemy was swarming them. Leo knew that he had to keep picking them off one by one, or the last moments of their lives would be spent in agony. The rifle's scope was his world now. He was no longer just a sniper. He was the final line between life and death for his team. Every shot he fired had to count. "Hold on," Leo whispered to himself, the last thing he could say before the storm closed in. Chapter 3: The Final Gambit. The landscape around Leo was a blur of smoke and ash as he moved swiftly along the ridge, his boots sinking into the loose earth beneath him. The deafening noise of distant gunfire, explosions, and the ever-present thrum of helicopters filled the air like a twisted symphony. He didn't have the luxury to stop and analyze the madness that surrounded him. His focus had narrowed, sharpened to a razor's edge. His team was depending on him, and failure wasn't an option. The ridge they were climbing up offered little cover. The terrain was uneven, jagged rocks and exposed roots making every step a calculated risk. Leo's senses were stretched to their breaking point, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, his ears straining for the sound of approaching footsteps or the whistling of enemy bullets. Behind him, Miller's voice crackled through the comms. "We're almost at the top, Captain. Just a few more minutes." The urgency in Miller's voice told Leo everything he needed to know. The enemy was closing in fast, and they wouldn't be far behind them. The climb to the ridge was supposed to be their safe haven, a place to regroup and plan their next move. But that illusion was fading fast. Leo knew that the moment they reached the top, they would be exposed, vulnerable. The only thing between them and certain death was him. He moved faster now, his body pushing itself to the limit. His sniper rifle felt like an extension of his own body, its weight a comforting presence. It was his lifeline, the one thing that had kept him alive through countless firefights, the one thing that had allowed him to keep his men alive too. The ridge loomed closer, a jagged line against the smoke-filled sky. Leo's mind raced, calculating the next moves, analyzing their dwindling options. Once they reached the top, they had to keep moving, keep finding new ways to stay ahead of the enemy. The terrain ahead was unknown, but they couldn't afford to wait. "Keep up, Miller," Leo snapped, the sound of his own voice pulling him back to the present. Miller's breathing was heavy, strained, but the man didn't slow. He had been through hell before. The rest of the team followed closely behind, their faces grim but determined. Leo could see the exhaustion etched into their expressions, the deep lines of fear and fatigue drawn into their features. But no one said a word. They had a job to do, and they would do it without question. They reached the summit, the ridge offering a brief moment of respite. The wind howled around them, kicking up dust and debris. The horizon stretched out before them, a dark, chaotic mess of smoke and fire. The enemy had surrounded them on all sides. This wasn't a battle anymore. This was survival. Leo turned his attention to the valley below, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. His breath caught when he saw them. Enemy soldiers, crouched low and moving swiftly through the smoke, their rifles raised and eyes sharp. They had spotted them. There was no escape now. "Captain, we're going to have to find our way out," Miller said, his voice cold. "We can't outrun them." Leo's fingers tightened on the grip of his rifle, his knuckles white. He knew Miller was right. The valley was their last chance, but they couldn't wait to be surrounded. The time for running was over. "I'll cover the rear," Leo said, his voice steady. "You take the lead. Get everyone to the extraction point. I'll hold them off." Miller hesitated, but only for a moment. "Roger that. But we're coming back for you." Leo didn't respond. He didn't have time for reassurances. He only had time to act. The team needed a way out, and if that meant staying behind to give them a chance, then that's what he would do. He was the sniper. It was his responsibility to ensure their survival, even if it meant his own sacrifice. "Move out," Leo barked, "and don't stop until you reach the drop zone." He watched them go, his team making their way down the ridge, moving with purpose. Miller led the charge, his rifle raised as he scanned the valley below. Leo stayed where he was, crouched low against the rocks, his scope focused on the enemy forces below. A small unit of soldiers had emerged from the cover of the trees, moving quickly and decisively toward the ridge. They hadn't seen him yet, and he needed to keep it that way. Leo's breath slowed as he aimed his rifle, the familiar weight of it a comfort in his hands. The scope adjusted, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The first enemy soldier moved into view. Leo's pulse quickened. He waited, every fiber of his being focused on that one moment, the split second before the shot. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. He had been here before. This was his element. The soldier stepped into the perfect line of sight. Breathe. Leo squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like thunder, the soldier dropping instantly to the ground, his body crumpling in a heap. Leo quickly adjusted his aim, moving to the next target. The remaining enemy soldiers scattered, diving for cover as the sound of the sniper rifle echoed through the valley. Leo fired again, another enemy falling to the ground. But more were coming. His ears picked up the sound of enemy vehicles approaching, the hum of trucks, the unmistakable sound of boots on gravel. They were bringing in reinforcements. Leo didn't have much time. With the first wave dealt with, he quickly shifted his position, retreating further into the rocky outcrop. The last thing he wanted was to be trapped. He needed to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of the enemy. Through the scope, Leo could see the smoke of the battle rising in the distance, his team still moving toward the extraction point. They were almost there. He just needed to buy them a little more time. Leo's mind raced as he set his sights on the next group of enemies. He had to make this count. He fired, then moved, firing again. He was a blur of motion, staying low, staying silent. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching longer than the last, but he couldn't stop. Not now. With the sounds of his team's escape growing fainter, Leo felt his resolve harden. They were his responsibility. As long as he had a breath in his body, he would protect them. But even as he fired again and again, he knew this mission was far from over. They still had a long way to go. And so did he. Chapter 4: The Weight of Choices. The hours bled together in a blur of exhaustion, gunfire, and strategy. The sniper's scope was his only view into the chaos, his rifle his only link to survival. Leo's body was beginning to betray him. His muscles ached, his vision blurred slightly from lack of sleep, and the ringing in his ears wouldn't subside. The weight of his rifle felt heavier with every passing moment, yet it was the only thing keeping him grounded in this war-torn landscape. His team had reached the extraction point, just as planned. For now, they were safe. But Leo knew better than anyone. The safety of his team meant little if he couldn't hold the line. If he failed now, if he hesitated for even a second, they would be dead. The radio crackled, and Leo instinctively tuned in, fingers tightening on the stock of his rifle. He expected it to be Miller. His voice was the steady rhythm of the battlefield, calm and collected, even when the world was falling apart. But it wasn't Miller. "Captain," a voice came through the static, sharp and panicked. "We've got incoming. A whole platoon's on our tail. They know where we are, and they're moving fast." Leo's blood ran cold, his heart beating harder in his chest. The last thing they needed right now was an enemy platoon bearing down on them. The team was vulnerable at the extraction point, and Leo couldn't afford to waste time. He had to act. "How far out?" Leo's voice was low but commanding, his focus razor-sharp despite the mounting pressure. 50 yards, maybe less. They've split into two groups, coming from both sides," the voice replied, breathless. "We don't have long." Leo's gaze shifted. flicking between the horizon and the tree line where he could see faint shadows moving. 2 groups, 50 yards. It wasn't much time, but it was all he had. He adjusted his position slightly, staying low behind a boulder, the earth soft and uneven under him. He exhaled slowly. He needed to buy his team more time. They couldn't be caught in the open. Not yet. Leo moved like a ghost, blending into the surrounding rocks and dirt. His scope scanned the tree line, locking on to the nearest enemy soldier. One shot, and the first wave would be one less problem. But he couldn't take them all down. His team was still vulnerable. He needed a distraction, something to keep the enemy occupied long enough for them to get away. His finger hovered over the trigger. A crackling noise interrupted his focus. Leo's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the sound of a mortar shell. Close, too close. The enemy was launching an attack from behind the ridge, forcing Leo to make a split-second decision. He could continue to hold his position and fire, picking off targets one by one, but that would leave his team exposed for longer than he could afford. Or he could lead the enemy into an ambush, forcing them into the open and giving his team the upper hand. Time was running out. Leo's mind raced. He couldn't fight them all, and he couldn't risk his team's survival for a few more kills. His only option was to set the trap. He grabbed a handful of rocks and threw them into the air, letting them crash down on the ground with a loud clatter. The sound echoed through the valley, a signal to the enemy that he was close. Leo's breath caught in his throat as the enemy's soldiers snapped their heads toward the noise, their rifles trained on the ridge where the rocks had fallen. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then the enemy advanced. It was a desperate gamble, but it had to work. Leo scrambled to reposition himself, moving quickly but quietly, a shadow in the night. His pulse raced as he surveyed the field. His team was still waiting at the extraction point, unaware of the new danger that was closing in on them. He took a deep breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. The first soldier entered his line of sight, unaware of the sniper just ahead. Leo's shot rang out, and the soldier dropped without a sound. But there were more. So many more. Leo's mind shifted into overdrive, every shot calculated, every movement precise. He couldn't afford to waste a single bullet. With each pull of the trigger, another soldier fell. He moved from one target to the next, staying calm, staying focused. But the enemy was coming at him faster now. They had spotted him, and the full force of their assault was bearing down. The sniper fire had caught them off guard, but now they were adjusting. The sound of incoming rounds was deafening as they returned fire, the air crackling with the threat of death. Leo's heart raced, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He was running out of time. His team was depending on him, but he was alone out here, surrounded by enemies who were closing in. Through the scope, Leo saw the second group of soldiers moving toward his position, their formation tighter, more deliberate. They had learned from the first wave. They were closing in. His position was becoming more and more compromised. If they made it to the ridge, Leo would be in a fight for his life. His radio crackled again, Miller's voice coming through with urgency. "Captain, we've got movement on the west side. Take them out. We're about to move." Leo's grip on the rifle tightened. His finger hovered over the trigger once again. He had only moments to decide what to do. He could risk another round of sniper fire and hope his team could break through the enemy's advance. Or he could take a different path, a more dangerous one. With a grim determination, Leo made his choice. "Move now," he barked into the comms, knowing full well that the time for hesitation was over. His team would fight their way out. Leo would buy them enough time to escape. The cost of that time? His own survival. The rifle fired again, and Leo's vision narrowed to the scope. Another soldier fell. Another second bought. But Leo didn't look back. He could already hear the sound of his team advancing. He could hear the frantic steps of soldiers rushing toward the extraction point. He was no longer in control of his own fate. The only thing he had left was to give them a chance. And with that, he fired again. Chapter 5, Breaking Point. The minutes dragged on like hours, each one suffocating under the weight of his decisions. Leo's breath came in ragged gasps, his focus narrowly fixed on the targets in his scope. He couldn't afford to think about what came next. There was only the present. There was only the next shot, the next move. As he adjusted his position once again, Leo heard the distant sound of gunfire. It was his team. They were moving, trying to clear the way for their extraction. But Leo knew better than to think they were safe. They were still in the open, and the enemy was closing in faster than they could anticipate. The ridge on his right had become a trap, a funnel that led directly into enemy territory. The soldiers advancing from that direction were relentless, pushing forward as if their lives depended on it, because in their minds, they did. They weren't just soldiers, they were predators hunting a single prey, Leo and his team. Leo's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he repositioned, dragging himself through the mud, trying to remain as unseen as possible. He had been out here too long, and his muscles were starting to rebel. His legs were stiff, his neck aching from the hours of holding his position. The strain was immense, but he didn't dare let up. He couldn't afford to. The sniper's scope was his only ally now, his only connection to the world beyond the fog of war. Leo peered through it, his world reduced to a few hundred yards of land that felt both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly close. Every movement, every breath felt amplified, like the whole world was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He spotted movement again, a soldier creeping between the trees, his rifle at the ready. Leo's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot, one kill. It was the only way he could create the opening his team desperately needed. But before he could squeeze the trigger, something shifted in his peripheral vision. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a second soldier moving parallel to the first. No, there were more. A whole line of them, moving toward his position, closing the gap. The first group wasn't a decoy. It was only the beginning. Leo's mind raced. He had to get them all. Every one of them. There was no room for mistakes. His rifle was steady now, his eye fixed in the scope, but the pressure was unbearable. His hands trembled from fatigue, his muscles aching, his mind reeling from the weight of the responsibility he carried. His team, his friends, his comrades, they were depending on him. If he failed, they would die. He knew that for a fact. He fired again. Another soldier dropped. But there were more, always more. The sound of gunfire intensified. The enemy had pinpointed his location, and the return fire came in torrents, exploding into the earth around him. Leo's world became a cacophony of explosions, gunfire, and shouts. His pulse quickened, the adrenaline surging through him, making him feel alive and dead all at once. He could feel the weight of the world pressing in on him, but he couldn't afford to lose control. The enemy wasn't retreating. They were advancing with a fury, each soldier more determined than the last. Leo's shots were accurate, each one finding its mark, but there were too many, too fast. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Leo could barely make out the figures of his team moving through the chaos. They were almost there. They were almost to safety, but not yet. They were still exposed. Captain, we're almost at the point. Miller's voice crackled over the radio. He sounded strained, out of breath. We're pinned down. We need cover fire, now. Leo's breath hitched. They were so close to the extraction point. He didn't have much time left. His mind snapped into action. He couldn't just take down the enemy one by one anymore. He had to disrupt them, disorient them, give his team a chance to break through. Leo scanned the area again, locking onto the group of enemy soldiers taking cover behind a cluster of rocks. They weren't expecting it. They weren't anticipating the explosion he was about to set off. He reached for the explosive strapped to his chest. His hands moved like a machine, quick, deliberate. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to. The moment his fingers worked the trigger, he set the charge to detonate. It was a calculated risk, but Leo had no other choice. He turned, knowing he had only seconds before the blast. "Cover your ears," he whispered to himself, even though he knew he was alone in this part of the world. Then he pressed the button. The explosion rocked the landscape, the sound deafening, the shockwave kicking up dust and debris. The soldiers closest to the blast were thrown off their feet, disoriented and momentarily stunned. Leo's heart slammed in his chest as he immediately began picking off the ones who were still moving, his rifle firing in quick succession. The smoke and dust created an eerie fog, a temporary barrier between him and the advancing enemy. But it wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough. More enemies were still coming. More were waiting behind the ridge. The fight had only just begun. "Captain," Miller's voice cut through the static again. "We've got movement, 2 clicks south. They're coming in hot." Leo didn't hesitate. He was already on the move, crawling forward, his body stiff from the hours of relentless pressure. His breath was shallow, his mind numb from exhaustion, but he kept his focus. He had to. There was no other choice. "Stay low," Leo ordered into the radio. "Don't stop moving. We're going to make it out." His fingers clenched around the rifle as he took another shot. One more soldier fell. The countdown to survival was growing shorter by the second, but Leo wasn't going to stop fighting until the last moment. He couldn't, not when so much was on the line. The enemy's advance was relentless, but so was Leo. Chapter 6: The Ground. The ground beneath Leo's hands felt as if it had become a part of him, the dirt and dust now embedded in his skin. Sweat beaded on his forehead, trickling down into his eyes, but he didn't blink. He couldn't afford to. Not when the odds were stacked against him and the survival of his team rested on his every move. He lay flat against the earth, his rifle steady in his hands, the barrel aimed at the advancing enemy. Through the scope, he could make out the movements of the soldiers, a parade of uniforms that were far too familiar. They were closing in on the perimeter of his team's last known position, pushing forward with a single-minded determination. They were hunting. Leo's breath slowed as he focused on his target. He couldn't miss. If he did, it was all over. He squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack. The soldier in the crosshairs crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. Leo didn't pause. He kept his eyes trained on the scope, his finger already moving to reload as another target emerged in the haze. This was it. This was the moment where everything could either fall apart or come together. The sounds of battle echoed around him, a constant drumbeat of chaos. Explosions, gunfire, the cries of the injured, all blending together into a symphony of death. But Leo's mind was calm, unnervingly so. He had been in worse situations. He had been surrounded, pinned down, with no way out. But this felt different. The weight of it, the tension, was suffocating, but Leo wasn't going to let it crush him. He fired again. Another soldier dropped. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands remained steady. He had trained for this. He had trained to be a ghost in the fog of war, to move without being seen, to kill without hesitation. But that wasn't the hard part anymore. The hard part was the realization that there were no reinforcements coming, no backup, no escape. Leo's team was in too deep, and there wasn't enough time to save them all. His mind raced. Miller's voice had crackled over the radio earlier, calling for extraction, but Leo knew the truth. They were too exposed, too surrounded. Extraction wasn't a viable option anymore. The only option was survival.
Captain, Miller's voice came through the radio, but it was strained. Leo could hear the tension in his voice. They're right on top of us. We need you to cover us, now.
Leo gritted his teeth, his hand moving instinctively to set another round into the chamber. He had to push forward just a little more. One last effort to hold the line. If he could clear a path for them, even just a few meters, maybe, just maybe, they could make it out alive. His gaze shifted to the left, scanning the area. There was movement, 3 figures approaching, moving in a tight formation. The sniper's eyes locked on them. They were too close. He couldn't wait any longer. His breath steadying, Leo squeezed the trigger again. This time, the bullet caught the enemy soldier just as he was about to move behind cover. Leo watched as the man collapsed, his body folding unnaturally before he hit the ground with a dull thud. The other 2 soldiers hesitated, their eyes scanning for the source of the shot, but they were too slow. Leo fired once more, and another soldier crumpled under the precision of his shot. But there was no time to savor the kill, no time to feel relief. The remaining soldier fired blindly in his direction, and Leo instinctively moved, rolling to his side to avoid the spray of bullets that kicked up the earth where he had been just a second ago. He wasn't invincible. He was just fast. The world around him exploded into action, with gunfire coming from every direction. The enemy wasn't backing down. They were relentless. They had no intention of letting Leo and his team leave alive. He had to get them out. He had to finish this.
Come on, Captain. Miller's voice came through again, this time desperate. We can't hold out much longer.
Leo's muscles screamed in protest as he shifted positions, moving through the rocky terrain, his scope always at the ready. The extraction was no longer an option, but the mission was still alive. His team needed him, and they needed him now more than ever.
He moved faster than he had before, his body operating on pure instinct, the shots becoming more frequent, the adrenaline propelling him forward. He was running on fumes, his legs weak, his arms heavy, but he wouldn't stop. Not now, not when it mattered most.
Another soldier fell. Leo's mind raced. How many more were there? How many more would he have to take down before they had a chance to escape? He repositioned again, this time targeting a heavy machine gun emplacement that had been tearing through the air. If he didn't silence it, his team wouldn't stand a chance. He lined up the shot, his heart pounding, his breath slow, measured. His finger found the trigger and held it there, the rifle's recoil slamming into his shoulder. The gunner dropped. He exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body, but only for a moment. The enemy soldiers who had been relying on that firepower were already regrouping, adjusting their positions. Leo could see the formation breaking apart, regrouping for another assault. The war was far from over. And neither was his fight. With a sharp intake of breath, Leo steadied his aim again. He wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Not when there was so much left to fight for. His team was counting on him. He would keep fighting until the last breath. The shots rang out once again, and the ground beneath him seemed to quake with each explosion, each moment of life or death decision. Leo's world had become a battlefield, and in this war there was no such thing as surrender. Not while he still had a shot left to take.
Chapter 7, Into the Heart of Darkness. The night had fallen, but Leo hadn't noticed. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness long before, his focus locked on the narrow path ahead, the terrain obscured by shadows and smoke. The battlefield had become a landscape of nightmares, the air thick with the acrid scent of burning debris, the crackle of distant gunfire mixing with the whispers of the wind. They had been on the run for hours now, pushing through the twisted remnants of a once thriving village that had become little more than a tomb. The charred remains of homes were now blackened silhouettes against the darkened sky. The air tasted like iron, and the ever-present hum of helicopters overhead only added to the oppressive weight of the silence that settled around them. Leo knew they were close to enemy territory. They had been moving stealthily, each step calculated, but time was running out. He had no illusions about their chances. His team was down to just a handful of soldiers, and exhaustion was starting to take its toll. The constant threat of enemy soldiers closing in had made even the slightest sound seem like an alarm, the threat of death always just a breath away. Miller limped beside him, clutching his side where blood soaked through his shirt. Leo had patched him up as best he could, but it wasn't enough. The wound was too deep. Miller's stamina had faded, his movements sluggish. Leo had to make a choice. He could either carry him or leave him behind. There was no room for weakness. But Leo had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. How much further? Miller rasped, his voice strained with pain, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Leo didn't answer right away. He didn't want to lie, but they were running out of time. The extraction point was still miles away, and the enemy was closing in on all sides. The helicopter was their only chance now, and that was rapidly slipping from their grasp. They couldn't keep moving like this, not with the enemy so close. If Leo couldn't turn the tide in the next few minutes, it would all be over. Not far, Leo said finally, his voice low, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. They moved in silence after that, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the occasional gasp of pain from Miller. Leo's hand never strayed far from his rifle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew the enemy was watching, waiting. He could feel them closing in, their presence like a shadow always on the edge of his vision. And then came the sound. A muffled thud. Leo froze. His heart skipped a beat as he whipped around, rifle raised. He scanned the area, his eyes darting over the ruined buildings, every movement a potential threat. But there was nothing. No enemy soldier, no sign of movement. Just the wind rustling through the rubble, carrying with it a sense of impending doom. Keep moving, Leo whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Miller or himself. They continued on, but the unease hung heavy in the air. Leo's mind raced with thoughts of what was to come. They were almost there. The extraction point was just ahead. If they could get there in time, they might have a chance. But it wasn't a guarantee. Another sound, this time louder. The unmistakable sound of boots hitting the ground, crunching gravel in a rhythmic, deliberate pace. Leo stopped dead in his tracks, turning to face the others. Get down, he hissed, pulling Miller behind a large concrete slab, its jagged edges jutting out of the rubble like the broken spine of a dead animal. The team fell to the ground, the weight of their bodies pressing into the earth as they held their breath. Leo's heart hammered in his chest as he strained to hear the sounds, every instinct screaming at him to move, to run. But they couldn't afford to make a mistake now. They were too close. For a long moment, there was nothing. The only sound was the wind, the soft rustling of leaves from a nearby tree. Leo's breath came in shallow bursts as he tried to steady himself, his rifle clutched tight in his hands, his knuckles turning white. His eyes flicked between the broken buildings and the dark sky, watching for any sign of the enemy.
And then it came. A flash of movement, a shadow darting between the wreckage. Leo's scope followed it, his finger twitching on the trigger, but he hesitated. The silhouette was too quick, vanishing before he could get a clear shot. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. They had been spotted. Miller turned to him, his voice a low growl of frustration. What do we do now? Leo's mind raced. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't afford to be trapped. They had to move, now. Cover me, he ordered, his voice sharp, commanding. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't asking for anything. The only thing that mattered now was their survival. Without waiting for a response, Leo rose to his feet, rifle in hand, and sprinted toward the next piece of cover, pushing through the pain that surged through his body with every step. Bullets zipped past him, too close, but he didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. Behind him, his team followed, moving quickly but cautiously, sticking to the shadows, trying to stay one step ahead of the encroaching enemy. The extraction point was almost within reach, and Leo could taste it, the salt of sweat on his lips, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. And then, as if the earth had suddenly split open beneath them, the world exploded in chaos. A distant explosion shook the ground, the shock wave sending dust and debris flying through the air. Leo hit the ground, his body instinctively protecting itself, but the explosion was followed by more. A barrage of blasts, one after another, shaking the earth, deafening the air. The enemy had launched their final assault. Cover! Leo shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The team scattered, ducking behind whatever cover they could find. The sniper's calm demeanor was replaced by the harsh reality of battle. They had to make it through this storm. The world became a blur of movement, smoke, fire, and death. Leo kept his eyes focused ahead, his finger on the trigger. Every shot counted now. There was no room for error. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw the extraction point in the distance. A faint glimmer of hope. But Leo knew better than to believe in miracles. He wasn't going to make it out alive unless he made the ultimate sacrifice. His team was counting on him. And he wouldn't fail them. Chapter 8, The Last Stand. The air crackled with the intensity of the assault. Leo's heartbeat thudded in his ears, drowning out everything except the sound of his own breath and the distant explosions that reverberated through the ground beneath them. Each detonation sent shock waves through the crumbling buildings, leaving dust swirling like ghosts in the aftermath. He was breathing heavily now, but his mind remained laser-focused. The extraction point was within his grasp. They could still make it. But the enemy was closing in, the sound of boots crunching on broken concrete growing ever louder. It wasn't just the soldiers from all directions. Leo knew there were other threats, too. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and blood, and in the distance, the flash of tracer rounds lit up the night like a deadly dance of light and shadow. The team was scattered, pinned down behind pieces of rubble, their positions as precarious as they were desperate. Miller was hunched behind a broken wall, clutching his side, his breathing ragged. The others, those who had remained alive, were all silent, eyes darting around, scanning for any movement, any sign of hope. Leo peered through the scope of his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area ahead. The extraction point was visible now, a small clearing near the edge of the forest. If they could just get to it, the chopper would be waiting. But the enemy knew where they were. They had to move quickly, or they would be trapped in the open. 5 minutes, Leo muttered under his breath. We're 5 minutes from hell. His voice wasn't loud, but the soldiers closest to him could hear the urgency in his words. They all knew what that meant. 5 minutes. Just 5 more minutes, and they might have a shot at escaping this hellish nightmare.
Cover me, Leo said, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos around them. His mind was already working through the plan, calculating their risks, weighing their chances. The others nodded, understanding the order, knowing there was no time for hesitation. Leo would lead them through the last stretch, through the oncoming storm, bullets, and death. With a swift motion, he rose from his crouch, rifle raised, and sprinted toward the next piece of cover, a wrecked car that had been abandoned in the middle of the street. The ground trembled beneath his feet with every explosion, but his focus remained on the path ahead. Bullets whizzed past him, the unmistakable hiss of danger too close for comfort, but he didn't flinch. He knew he couldn't afford to. Each movement was calculated, precise. Every second counted now. He ducked behind the car, eyes scanning the area, looking for any sign of movement.
Go! Leo yelled. He didn't have to say more. His team followed suit, moving as one. They had no choice now. There was no going back. They were out of time. But the enemy was not as far behind as they had hoped. The first explosion sounded too close, a deafening roar that made the ground shake beneath their feet. A series of blasts followed in rapid succession, forcing Leo and his team to duck behind whatever cover they could find. The world erupted in fire and chaos, smoke billowing into the night sky. The enemy wasn't just shooting, they were encircling them. Leo's eyes scanned the area once again, catching sight of a few soldiers darting from cover to cover, their movements deliberate. They were coming closer, and the countdown had begun. "Get to the trees," Leo shouted, pointing toward the forest that was just within reach. The clearing was almost there. If they could just reach the trees, they could make it to the extraction point. But they were out of time. The enemy opened fire in a sudden burst of rage, their bullets ricocheting off the concrete and metal like deadly hail. Leo heard a shout, followed by the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. One of his men. The sight of the fallen soldier hit Leo like a punch to the gut, but he had no time to mourn. He couldn't afford to lose focus now. "Keep moving," Leo barked, his voice a low, guttural command. The team sprinted toward the trees, some falling back under the barrage of enemy fire, others struggling to keep up. Miller was trailing behind, his wound worsening, but Leo couldn't stop. Not now. With every step, they grew closer to the extraction point, but so did the enemy. The forest loomed ahead like a dark, impenetrable wall. Leo's mind was racing now, calculating every angle. He could hear the crackle of enemy radios, the growing sense of panic as they closed in on him. They knew he was leading the charge. The trees were only a few yards away now, but the air was thick with the acrid scent of burning debris. Leo's body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. He reached the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest as the sounds of gunfire grew louder behind him. But then, a figure appeared. Out of the corner of his eye, Leo saw movement, someone running toward him from the darkness of the forest. The glint of a rifle. The enemy. Instinctively, Leo dropped to one knee, taking aim. His rifle fired twice in rapid succession. The figure collapsed, falling to the ground with a grunt. "Move!" Leo shouted, his voice hoarse, his chest tight with fear. The rest of the team sprinted into the forest, just as the final shots rang out, the enemy closing in behind them. Leo followed, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his resolve stronger than ever. The extraction point was within reach, but the path ahead was filled with unknown dangers. He could feel the eyes of the enemy on his back, every step echoing through the woods like a countdown to the end. But they were almost there. Leo's heart raced as he pushed forward, determination surging through his veins. He wouldn't let them die. Not like this. As he neared the edge of the forest, the roar of a helicopter's blades filled the air, the sound of salvation. "Over here!" Leo yelled, waving his arm above his head. The helicopter hovered overhead, a dark silhouette against the dim sky. The team ran toward it, Leo leading them, his eyes fixed on the chopper. They could hear the screams of the enemy behind them, but they didn't stop. One by one, the soldiers climbed aboard, breathless and wounded, their faces drawn with fatigue and fear. Leo was the last to board. He took one last look at the battlefield, the flames and smoke rising into the night. He didn't look away. The helicopter rose into the air, the ground receding beneath them, the battle fading into the distance. Leo exhaled slowly, the weight of the past hours pressing down on him, the blood, the fear, the death. But they were alive. They had made it. For now. Chapter 9. The Price of Survival. The helicopter's engines hummed steadily, its rhythmic roar drowning out everything but the cold, biting wind whipping through the open door. The team sat in silence, their bodies bruised, battered, and broken from the assault. Each of them had been changed by the events of the past few hours, their eyes haunted by memories too fresh to forget. Leo felt it too, the weight of survival pressing down on his chest, the nagging sense that the battle was far from over. The last hour had felt like a blur, a maddening series of calculated risks and gut-wrenching decisions. But now, suspended in the air, a strange emptiness settled over him. They had survived the ambush, evaded death at the hands of a merciless enemy, and made it to the extraction point. But at what cost? What would be left of them once the adrenaline wore off? The medic, McAllister, sat across from Leo, his face pale, his hands trembling as he applied pressure to a gaping wound on Miller's side. Miller was barely conscious, his breath shallow and labored, but he was still alive. For now. "Can't believe we made it," McAllister muttered, his voice strained. "Can't believe any of us made it." Leo didn't answer. He couldn't. The reality of their survival hadn't settled yet. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an ending, a final breath before the inevitable next battle. But there was no time to dwell on that. They still had a long way to go before they were truly safe. The rest of the team sat in the rear of the helicopter, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Jameson, their youngest soldier, stared out the window, his eyes wide but unfocused, as if searching for something in the night sky. He hadn't spoken since they boarded the chopper, his silence a stark contrast to the chaos that had followed them to the extraction point. "We're not out of the woods yet," Leo said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping against metal. "They'll come after us. They'll track us down." He knew it was inevitable. There was no way the enemy would let them escape without a fight. Even now, as they flew high above the war-torn landscape, Leo could sense the hunt. The wolves were still on their trail, and their blood would be the price of survival. It always was. Miller stirred, his face contorting in pain. McAllister adjusted his grip on the wound, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. It was too late for that. The helicopter's cabin felt like a tomb. The only sound, the hum of the blades slicing through the night air. "We can't stop." "Not yet," Leo muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The team's safety depended on reaching the designated safe house, a remote outpost deep in friendly territory. But even then, they wouldn't be safe. The threat of pursuit was too real, and Leo could feel the weight of every second ticking by. The chopper lurched suddenly, throwing everyone off balance. Leo's heart skipped a beat as the floor beneath him tilted. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. "Sir, we've got a problem. Enemy radar's locked onto us. We're going to have to adjust course." Leo's pulse quickened. They weren't safe. Not yet. He shot a glance at the medic, who looked equally alarmed. McAllister's hands tightened around Miller's injury, but it was clear he was struggling to keep his composure. "Can you stabilize him?" Leo asked, trying to steady his own voice. McAllister didn't look up. "I'm doing what I can, but I need to get him to proper care fast. He's losing blood fast." Leo's jaw clenched. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, decisions to be made with little time to think. Their only chance at surviving was to keep moving, keep the pressure on the enemy. Every moment they lingered in the air, they were vulnerable. If the enemy had locked onto them once, it wouldn't take long for them to try again. "Pilot," Leo barked, his voice sharp. "Increase altitude. Get us out of range." There was no answer immediately, just the deafening whir of the blades and the distant sound of enemy fire. Then the pilot's voice came through the intercom once more, his tone tense. "Already on it. Hang tight." The chopper shuddered as it climbed higher, the lights below them becoming tiny pinpricks of light as the terrain below blurred into shadow. Leo's eyes never left the horizon. Every second counted, and he couldn't afford to lose any more time. The team fell into a tense, uneasy silence as they ascended into the night sky. Leo could feel the tension growing, thickening like a fog in the cramped cabin. There was no room for error now. The next move could be their last. Time passed in slow, agonizing minutes as the chopper maneuvered through the night. Every time Leo looked at his watch, the seconds felt heavier. The minutes felt like hours. He glanced over at McAllister, who had stopped trying to stop Miller's bleeding. Instead, he sat back, staring blankly at the floor, sweat dripping from his brow. The reality was settling in. It didn't matter how hard they fought. It didn't matter how far they flew. Some things were beyond their control. Miller's breathing grew more labored. Come on," McAllister whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just hold on a little longer." Leo's grip tightened on the seat, his knuckles white. The distance between them and safety stretched out before him like an endless chasm. But there was no turning back now. His team was counting on him, and no matter how dire the situation, he would never give up on them. Not when they had already come this far. Through the window, Leo saw the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. He didn't know if they would make it to the safe house. He didn't know if they would survive the next moment. But in that moment, as the sun's first rays touched the battlefield below, Leo made a silent vow. Whatever came next, he would keep them alive. He would keep fighting until the very end. There would be no surrender. Not now. Not ever. "Just a little longer," Leo murmured under his breath. "We're almost there." Chapter 10. The Final Shot. The helicopter rocked violently, its tail thrashing like a wounded animal. The whirring blade struggled against the growing turbulence, sending a deep, bone-shaking vibration through the fuselage. Leo's grip on the side of his seat tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the dirt and blood that covered his face. They were still alive. But for how long? The team was battered, their bodies showing the toll of the battle they had fought and the sacrifice they had made to stay alive. Miller's condition had worsened, his breathing shallow, his face ashen. McAllister worked relentlessly, applying pressure to the soldier's wound with a calmness that betrayed the desperation of the situation. Leo could feel the weight of the minutes, the endless ticking of the clock. The longer they lingered in the sky, the closer the enemy would get. They were still in enemy territory. and they weren't out of danger yet. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, strained and sharp.
We've got enemy choppers on our tail. Can't outrun them. We need to make a hard left to avoid incoming fire. Hold tight.
Leo's heart slammed in his chest as the helicopter jerked violently to the left. The whole crew braced for impact, but it didn't come. The pilot's hands gripped the controls, fighting against the forces that threatened to rip them from the sky. Leo's eyes darted to the door. The ground below was a chaotic mess of dirt, rubble, and the smoldering remains of the battlefield. The enemy was still out there, and they would do anything to prevent their escape. But Leo couldn't afford to be distracted by fear. His focus was singular, his mind narrowing to one thing only: survival. The next move had to be decisive. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, a final shot, something to stop the pursuit and allow them to reach safety. Leo knew that, as the sniper, it was his responsibility to make that call. His mind was already working the angles. The helicopter couldn't outrun the enemy. They needed to land, but that meant drawing the enemy's fire. Leo glanced at McAllister, who had his hands full with Miller. He needed to make sure his team survived, and that meant taking the shot that would buy them time. "Pilot," Leo shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the helicopter's engines. "Take us low. Get us in range of the enemy chopper. I'm going to take them out." The pilot didn't hesitate. "You got it, Sergeant. Brace yourselves." The chopper dipped low, skimming the treetops and sending a rush of wind through the cabin. Leo could hear the faint sound of enemy choppers growing louder, closing in. They were nearly in range, but so were the enemy's guns. His hand gripped his rifle with a familiar steadiness, despite the chaos around him. The weight of the weapon felt comforting in his hands, his one shot at salvation. He peered through the scope, his breath steady as he locked onto the enemy chopper. The target was closing fast, its rotor blades a blur against the sky. Time seemed to slow. He adjusted his aim, accounting for the wind, the distance, the angle. His fingers found the trigger, and he took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, mentally preparing for the kill. And then, in a heartbeat, he squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, the impact echoing across the battlefield. The enemy chopper veered wildly, smoke pouring from its engine as it spiraled toward the ground. Leo's shot had struck its fuel line, igniting a fire that sent it plummeting into the earth. The explosion lit up the sky like a fireball, casting a brief, violent glow over the surrounding landscape. The helicopter jerked again, the sudden jolt throwing everyone off balance. Leo's rifle slid from his hands as the world around him blurred.
"Direct hit," the pilot shouted. "We're clear for now. We're making a break for it."
But Leo didn't hear him. His mind was focused on the kill. He had done it. He had made the shot that would give them the chance to escape. He turned back to McAllister, his pulse still pounding in his ears. Miller's breathing was weak, but steady. He had bought them time, but for how long? The pilot's voice broke through the tension. "We're heading for the extraction point. It's a couple of miles away. Just hold on, everyone. We're almost there." Leo didn't speak. He couldn't. His body was too tired, too worn. But the adrenaline still surged through his veins, pushing him forward, keeping him focused on the mission. They had survived the assault. They had survived the chopper chase. But there was still one final leg of the journey ahead. As the helicopter soared higher, Leo looked at the faces of his team. McAllister was tending to Miller, his face lined with exhaustion but determined. Jameson had his eyes closed, his body slumped against the wall, trying to catch his breath. And then there was Leo, no longer just the sniper. He had become something more. A leader, a protector, a survivor. But even as they ascended into the sky, Leo knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be another battle, another enemy, another challenge. But for now, they had one. They had survived the last hour, and for that, they could breathe a little easier. The sun was beginning to rise in the distance, casting long shadows across the battlefield below. For the first time in hours, Leo allowed himself a single moment of peace. They were alive. They had made it. And that was all that mattered.